All right, today's lesson is going to come from Vayishlach, which is actually the eighth portion from the book of Genesis. And Vayishlach means, and he sent, which is very apropos considering one of the very first things we read about in this portion is about how Jacob divides his family. He divides his possessions into waves because he thinks the doomsday clock is counting down, and a lot of what he owns, a lot of who he loves, might be coming to an end. And why is that? Well, it's because it's the very first time that he's meeting his twin brother Esau in 20 years. And the last time he seen him, the last time he talked to them, it was nowhere near good terms. It was in no uncertain terms, matter of fact, that Esau had planned on killing his brother Jacob because of how it was he obtained the birthright. He felt swindled, he felt cheated, and so whenever he leaves Laban's territory, he sends off messengers to his brother and say, hey, I'm about to come through. And word gets back, there's going to be your brother Esau along with 400 men. And Jacob gets really, really scared. He has a lot of anxiety over the issue. And so that's what we're kind of jumping straight into the waters with in this portion. And right before this meeting happens, we actually see that he sends his family, his possessions, the ones he loves. We see that he puts them out in waves, and he's alone by himself, and all of a sudden he's attacked. He's really thinking he's wrestling Esau, his brother, but we find out that there's a wrestling match that actually changes his life forever. And when it comes to Vayishlach, it's going to cover Genesis 32, verse 4, all the way through the entire chapter of Genesis 36. And there's a lot of stuff that happens, of course, as I have alluded to, the meeting of Jacob and Esau. There's the wrestling match. There is the whole debacle that happens with Shechem, with Dinah and the men there. Uh, on top of all that, we also have the death of Rachel, which was a big deal. We also have the death of Isaac. And then we learn a little bit about the family of Esau and how there's kind of a mirroring of what happens with Israel and Jacob. And before we get into a lot of that, I want us to take a look at the background and history of Jacob and Esau. And if you remember back whenever there was the pregnancy that Rachel had with the two boys, one of the things that you'll discover was, you know, Isaac and Rebecca, they weren't able to have children just right off the bat. They didn't have children right off the cuff. Jacob and Esau were not honeymoon babies, nowhere even close. Matter of fact, they struggled with infertility even longer than my wife and I to this day have even known each other, because it was a period of 20 years. We talk about how Jacob had to develop with his life, his occupation. Everything drastically changed in his 20 years of service to Laban. That 20 years of service that he had to Laban is on par with how long it took Isaac and Rebecca to even conceive and to have an achievable pregnancy. And so we see in the text in the book of Genesis that whenever it finally happens, whenever she is finally blessed to start carrying this next generation, she even goes to God and she's like, how is it that I'm blessed? How is it that I'm finally having this? But everything feels so wrong about this pregnancy. And we find out that it says there's not two babies in your womb, which of course there was. It's actually said there are two nations. And it says nations and not brothers, almost like even from the womb, they're diametrically opposed to one another. You know, different ethics, different mindsets. They've got different ways of life. Like, it doesn't say that they're brothers, which to me is a curious statement. Take that as what you will. But whenever the boys are born, of course, we have Esau, who was born first. And then the curious part of the story is when it talks about how Jacob, which Yaakov in Hebrew, when he was born, says that he's grasping at his brother's heel. And what we don't recognize in English, because it's a completely different language than what Hebrew is, there's actually a word play at play with the name of Jacob. And that is, if you take a look at Yaakov, just take the first letter off of the word, off of the name, you're left with the word Akev, which actually is the word for heel. Well, if you actually take a look at the letter that you remove from Yaakov, and it's the letter Yud. That letter Yud, the word Yud, actually means hand. And so when you put the hand on the heel, you actually get Yaakov, which is Jacob. And it's a literal picture of what we find with his name being. Crazy thing this Hebrew is, right? Well, regardless, I taught a Bible class last night at church, and it was over the general topic of Jacob. We were kind of doing a QA talk session over the whole life. And one of the things I mentioned about Jacob and like his history, his past, and especially when it concerns the heel, was if you make an observation about the heel, one of the things you will come to realize it's the very first part of your body that really makes contact with the earth. When you get up, you get out of bed in the mornings or whenever your schedule is. I work nights half the time, so maybe when you first get up during the day, the very first part of your body to make contact with the earth is your heel. And when you take a look at the heel, it's not a straight line. As a matter of fact, it's almost kind of like a 90-degree turn without a sharp point. It kind of goes from one way. It's an indirect shape. And when you take a look at Jacob and his life and how some of the things went down, he wasn't direct in a lot of his approach to things, how he obtained things. And I'm not going to get into the whole debacle of, how he achieved the blessing and the birthright and all of that. That's a much greater scope than what I care to cover this morning. But on this approach on how he is able to get these things, he's not direct. He doesn't go straight to his father, hey, this is Yaakov. I want the blessing. I want the deal. Now, if it was the way Rebecca wanted to have it done, sure, great. Of course, it's how it would have been. But even just like the shape of what he's named after, he's not direct. He has to go in the skins of his brother. He has to go into the clothes, the garments of his brother. He has to assume the identity of his elder brother to get the blessing, which I feel like there's a lot that could be said there. Whenever we find the episode at Bethel, I believe when he's going to Laban, he's even telling God, if this happens and when this happens, then I will worship, then I will do this. And it just kind of seems like some as the indirect the actions were. At times, Jacob himself is indirect, but Jacob wasn't always Jacob. We actually find in Scripture he's one of the handful of individuals who actually was rechristened, rebranded. He was renamed. And I want us to take a look at that and what caused that. And we're going to look at Genesis 32, verse 22. And it says, he arose that night and took his wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of Jabbok. And he took them, and he sent them over the brook, and he sent over what he had. He was scared for not only his life, but also his family, his children, his possessions, much like what we said earlier. And so he's kind of sending them off in waves just in case he kind of gets a sucker punch from Esau. Maybe there's going to be this chance that a fraction or portion or faction is going to live. So he sends them off. And I love Jabbok. One of the studies I'd done was the meaning of that means emptied. And at this point, Jacob has acquired all these things. He's worked hard. These were not easy 20 years leading up to this point in time. And it's probably a gutting feeling knowing that he is very much possible about to lose everything. He is afraid of what's going to come as a result of this meeting with Esau. Verse 24 says, then Jacob was left alone, and it says, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked, tell me your name, I pray. And he said, why is it that you ask about my name? And he blessed him there. And so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Penuel, the sun rose up on him, and he limped on his hip. Therefore, to this day, the children of Israel do not eat the muscle that shrank, which is in the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and muscle that shrank. So I feel like there's a lot that we could learn from this. I've made the comment historically about how when it comes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, I feel like I probably relate more to Jacob than either of the other two. And I feel part of that is due in respects because if this faith is going to be real to us and if we're going to grow and walk in life, there's going to be things that we struggle with. There's going to be things that we wrestle with. And after this point of wrestling, after this point of contention, we're not going to walk away the same. And I feel like for a lot of Jacob's life, even on his heel, so to speak, there was a lot of running. He had to rush to get this blessing, and then he had to get out of Dodge because his brother wanted to kill him. One of the points of contention that Laban had with Jacob was that he fled during the night and, took away his daughters and did all this stuff, even though he had worked in agreement and then went above and beyond time wise and labor wise. And he did all these things, but he was going, 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 going. And I feel like sometimes one of the greatest experiences that we can have with God is for him to throw a limp in our walk where we can't run anymore. Sometimes we are touched in a way to where we kind of limp out of situations so that way we can have these moments and we can have these encounters that we're supposed to have. Did Jacob and Esau need to have the come to Jesus moment where they came face to face? Yeah, they really did. Would it have happened differently if Jacob didn't run? Obviously. And sometimes we have episodes that bring us way out of our way. They hold us in a point, in a time, for whatever amount of time, so that way what needs to be done can be finally taken care of. Because, truth be told, if we wait for the perfect moment for things to happen, we're going to be waiting forever. Because sometimes we just have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. Sometimes we've got to grit our teeth and we just got to weather the storm and we've got to push through. One of the pieces of advice I give a lot of young people anymore when they're asking for it is there's moments in life to where, say, for example, if you're afraid to check your bank account, that means you need to check your bank account. If you are feeling this frustration or this anxiety, obviously, number one, pray about it. That's what you need to start off with. But chances are you're going to have to deal with it. Don't put it on the back burner because then it's going to become this exponential problem that's going to do nothing but grow and grow and grow. And I want us to circle back to after this wrestling match, he wants this blessing. And in verse 28, he says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and men and have prevailed." Remember me talking about Jacob and his name meaning like hand on the heel. With the heel, it's at a curve. It's not a direct, if we were to draw a picture of a heel, it's not going to be directly down, directly left, down, right, anything like that. There's going to be a curve. It's an indirect shape. And if you go to the Gospels and you start reading about John the Baptist in the Gospels is actually quoting Isaiah 40, verse 3, and he talks about how his purpose was to make straight the way for the one. And when you take a look at that word straight, it's the word Yasar. And when you take a look at Yisrael, Israel in Hebrew, they say the root word for Israel, when you read El, that's going to be the most simplistic name of God in Hebrew. The rest of the word for Yisrael says it actually comes from the word Yasar, which means straight or to make straight. And I think it's kind of a beautiful thing that we see Jacob in life starting as Jacob, but in the end, after he has these experiences, after he starts being lined out, when he starts laboring and there's a development in how God uses him in his works to bless the world, and he has this encounter where he struggles and he wrestles with God in some way, shape, or form. I know Judaically, I know a lot of the times they talk about how it wasn't God that he wrestled with, that it was an angel, even if the angel, I believe, would have been sent by the authority of God. So one way, shape, or form, he might have wrestled the mailman for God as far as we know. But in one way, shape, or form, talks about how he went from being an indirect individual who indirectly received blessings, indirectly would agree with God to things, but he became changed. He developed into somebody who was more direct. He was more straight with God. And of course, it reminds me of Hebrews, and it talks about how we can come boldly before the throne of God and make petitions to make these requests. We have the straight shot, we have the straight access. And I just kind of feel like that's something that is necessary and vital in our relationship. We don't have to beat around the bush. Let's start being more direct. And there's times and moments I feel like in relationships we can kind of tease, or we can kind of build anticipation to a question, or we can build anticipation to a gift, so to speak. You know, my son's birthday was this week, and we can kind of have a little bit of air of mystery there. But I feel like when a relationship is genuine, when push comes to shove, we can be direct in our approach, we can be direct in our walk, and sometimes we will have, like I said earlier, we will have these encounters to where how we walk is forever changed. And I feel like if we don't have one of those moments, maybe we haven't been authentic. You know, sometimes we go through some incredible circumstances and we come out for the better. One of the stories I'll share in closing is, you know, years ago, I believe I was in the seventh grade, and my grandmother wound up having to have surgery. And I mean, this wasn't any minor surgery, it was a surgery that changed her entire life. She was a smaller woman. We joked that she didn't eat enough to keep a bird alive, but my grandmother was also diabetic. And as a result, through complications and things, she wound up losing both of her legs just below the knee. And at this point in time, my grandmother's like 60s, mid 60s, I care to say. And she went in to have this surgery, and she came out not having any legs. And my grandmother was a busy woman every morning. She made every meal every day, breakfast, lunch, dinner. She would have these cravings for lemon squares, or she would have these cravings for cookies or cakes. And of course, with her being diabetic, she couldn't eat them. So she said that was her job to make sure everybody else could enjoy them. Well, whenever you don't have legs, it's going to drastically change your life. And so, with this surgery that she had, she wound up having to go through rehabilitation. She wound up getting some prosthetic legs. And, you know, here we find a lady in her mid 60s. Chances are that it's not going to go that great. And a lot of people were quizzical, they were skeptical how great it was going to be. And of course, when people go into rehab groups, they get put into people with similar age, similar experience, issues. Well, there's not a lot of ladies going into their golden years that have just recently lost both legs. So she was actually put in rehab groups with like teenage kids, like 17-year-old boys who lost a single leg in a motorcycle incident or things of that nature, and having to learn how to walk all over again, take steps of faith that weren't even her real legs. And my grandmother absolutely blown everybody away. And it was crazy because not that long into it, she was actually able to get up and walk around. She didn't have to use a cane. She didn't have to use a walker. Matter of fact, Dr. Bowie, who was her doctor, brought her around a little bit and kind of did a little circuit with her where she went to different presentations and different meetings. They had people watch and observe how she walked. And he said you almost couldn't find any telltale signs that she had anything wrong with her. I believe there was a couple of them where they had somebody who didn't have any legs amputated at all. Like that was just how they were, and they would walk, and people, okay, who has what problem? And they never could peg my grandmother for being the one who was a double leg amputee. The only thing that was even the smallest of telltale signs was she kind of, I think, dragged a little bit of her right heel, which to me was crazy. But she had this moment in life that absolutely changed everything. And I remember asking her, like, you know, every morning she cooked breakfast. As soon as she was done with breakfast, she cleaned the dishes. When she was done with the dishes, she would go into the living room and she would push a vacuum cleaner all around the house and clean everything up. And I remember asking her one day, I was like, you know, why do you do so much in the condition you're in? And she said, well, somebody's got to do it. And I know it's not going to be your grandpa. But it was a moment seeing her go through what she did that changed my outlook on everything forever. Like, for me in my mind, this lady just took what was told that was going to be impossible for her to do, and she shoved it back down everybody's throats and told me, don't tell me what I can and can't do. And I feel like even whenever we have these moments in life that are nowhere near as drastic nor life altering, we should be able to walk away in these situations, even with a little bit of a limp, even if we do scuff our right heel a little bit. We're walking in a way that makes a difference in this world and helps provide a better outlook for people because we are walking in faith. It's something that has been developed in us, and we're no longer relating to the lowest point of who we are, somebody who is indirect, but we're somebody who is walking with our head up straight ahead, and we're walking in the strength of who he is. And so, as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.